The morning mist clung to the Thames on that January day in 1720. London was stirring to life, merchants hurrying across cobblestones, their breath visible in the cold air. In the coffee houses of Exchange Alley, men gathered around tables sticky with spilled chocolate and wine, speaking in hushed, excited voices. The talk was all of stocks, of fortunes to be made, of a company that promised riches beyond imagination, the South Sea Company. And on this particular morning, shares were trading at £128 each, a respectable price, but one that would soon seem quaint, almost laughable, as the year unfolded. This is the story of Britain's first great financial bubble, a tale of kings and commoners, of brilliant minds and foolish hearts, of how an entire nation became drunk on the promise of easy wealth, and how that dream became a nightmare that would echo through the centuries. But to understand how Britain fell under this spell, we must travel back to when the seeds of this madness were first planted in the soil of war and debt. The year was 1701. Queen Anne sat on the throne, and England had been drawn into what historians would call the War of the Spanish Succession. It was a conflict that would rage for 12 long years. A war fought across battlefields from Germany to Gibraltar, from the Caribbean to the coasts of Spain. Wars, as they always do, cost money, enormous amounts of money. The Crown needed funds to pay soldiers, to buy cannons, to build ships. And so the debt mounted, higher and higher, until it became a crushing weight on the nation's shoulders. By 1711, Lord Treasurer Robert Harley faced a problem that kept him awake at night. The war debt had grown so large that traditional methods of financing were no longer sufficient. The Bank of England held an exclusive charter as the only joint stock bank, limiting the government's options. Something new was needed, something creative. And so, in the summer of 1711, an idea took shape. Not a bank, for that monopoly was already claimed, but a trading company, a company that would assume the nation's debts in exchange for something magnificent. Exclusive trading rights with the Spanish colonies of the New World. The South Sea Company was born from this marriage of necessity and ambition. Picture the scene as the charter was signed. Quill pens scratching on parchment, sealing wax dripping red in the candlelight. The company would supply 4,800 slaves each year for 30 years to Spanish plantations. It was a business built on human misery, but one that promised tremendous profits. The investors who gathered in those early days spoke in whispers of the treasures that awaited them. Gold from Peru, silver from Mexico, the endless wealth of the Spanish Main. They imagined galleons heavy with precious metals sailing into London's port, their holds bursting with riches. But reality, as it so often does, proved less generous than dreams. When the War of the Spanish Succession finally ended in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht, the terms were disappointing. Yes, Britain had won trading rights with Spain's colonies, but the Spanish were careful to limit these privileges. They would take a percentage of profits. They would restrict the number of ships. In the end, Britain was permitted to send just one vessel per year for general trade. One ship, when investors had imagined entire fleets. The company's first trading voyage was delayed until 1717. By 1718, when England and Spain went to war again, trade was discontinued entirely. The South Sea Company, founded on dreams of maritime commerce, was barely trading at all. But something interesting happened that same year. King George I, the Hanoverian monarch who had claimed the British throne just 4 years earlier, agreed to become governor of the South Sea Company. Nothing instills confidence quite like the endorsement of the ruling monarch. Picture the effect this had on public imagination. Here was a company blessed by the crown itself, a company that bore the weight of royal approval. Surely such an enterprise was destined for greatness. And so we come to 1720, the year that would change everything. January brought with it the usual London winter. Grey skies, coal smoke hanging in the air, the Thames flowing dark and cold beneath London Bridge. In the coffee houses, the talk continued. South Sea shares were steady at £128, a solid investment perhaps, but hardly the stuff of dreams. Yet something was stirring beneath the surface. Rumours, whispers, tales of secret negotiations with Spain, of new trading agreements, of profits beyond calculation. By February, the shares had climbed to £175, still reasonable, still within the realm of rational investment. But the momentum was building, like a wave gathering strength far out at sea. In the company's offices, a man named John Blunt was watching the numbers with great interest. Blunt was no ordinary businessman. He had been a director of the Sword Blade Company, and he understood better than most how to manipulate both markets and minds. Blunt looked at those rising share prices and saw opportunity, not just for profit, but for something grander, a scheme that would make him one of the richest men in England. He began to craft a plan, one that would soon ensnare an entire nation. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The government owed enormous sums of money, debts that weighed heavily on the public purse. What if the South Sea Company could assume all of this debt? The government would be free of its burden, and investors would own shares in a company backed by the full faith and credit of the Crown. In April, Parliament considered the proposal. The debates were heated, voices echoing through the chambers of Westminster. Some members questioned the wisdom of placing so much faith in a single company. Others worried about the precedent being set. But the promise of financial relief was too tempting to resist. The vote was called. Hands were raised, and Parliament approved the South Sea Company's proposal to assume the national debt. The company paid £7.5 million for this privilege, money that flowed into the Treasury's coffers like a golden river. The announcement sent shockwaves through London's financial district. Here was a company that now held debts totaling tens of millions of pounds, debts backed by the government itself. Surely such a company was as safe as the Bank of England. Safer, perhaps, given its trading privileges and royal connections. Speculators began to circle like hungry wolves. They purchased shares with eagerness, with desperation, with borrowed money and mortgaged property. By May, the price had soared to £550 per share. But John Blunt was just getting started. He introduced innovations that would seem familiar to modern investors, and just as dangerous. Shares could now be purchased on an installment plan. An investor need not pay the full price up front. A small deposit would secure ownership, with the balance due in future payments. Suddenly, clerks and servants, widows and tradesmen, people who had never owned a stock in their lives, could afford to speculate. The barriers to entry crumbled like ancient walls. Blunt went further. The company began issuing loans at favourable interest rates, money that investors could use to buy even more shares. It was a circular scheme, money flowing from the company to investors and back again, creating the illusion of genuine economic activity while actually just recycling capital. And then came Blunt's masterstroke. The company would lend money to investors specifically to purchase South Sea stock. It was a scheme so audacious, so reckless, that it could only end in disaster. But in the fever of 1720, it seemed like genius. By June, the entire city of London had contracted the speculative fever. In the coffee houses of Exchange Alley, fortunes were made and lost between breakfast and dinner. Servants abandoned their posts to trade stocks. Ladies of society discussed share prices over tea and cakes. The government, alarmed by the proliferation of speculative companies that had sprung up to imitate the South Sea Company's success, passed the Bubble Act. This law required all new joint stock companies to obtain royal authorization before operating. It was meant to protect investors from fraud, to separate legitimate enterprises from mere schemes. But the act had an unexpected effect. Rather than dampening speculation, it seemed to validate the South Sea Company as one of the few truly legitimate investments. Shares shot up to £890 in June, nearly 7 times their January price. And still, the fever burned higher. July brought with it the height of summer and the height of madness. The sun beat down on London's crowded streets as crowds gathered outside the South Sea Company's offices in Bishopsgate. The air was thick with excitement and sweat, with the desperate energy of people who believed they were witnessing the birth of a new age of prosperity. The share price climbed day by day, hour by hour, sometimes minute by minute. £900, £950, £990. And then, in that sweltering July heat, South Sea shares touched £1,000 each. £1,000, more than many working families would see in a lifetime. The stock had increased by nearly 800% in just 6 months. At £1,000 per share, the South Sea Company was valued at more than the entire annual output of England. It was worth more than all the land, all the farms, all the factories in the kingdom. The mathematics made no sense. But mathematics had long since been abandoned in favour of dreams. In his rooms at the Royal Mint, Sir Isaac Newton watched the spectacle with growing concern. Here was a man who had unlocked the secrets of gravity and motion, who had peered into the very mechanics of the universe. Yet even Newton had been caught up in the South Sea fever. Newton had bought shares early in the speculation and sold them at a handsome profit. But as prices continued to climb, he could not resist the temptation to buy back in. Surely, he reasoned, his mathematical genius would allow him to time the market perfectly. He was wrong. Like so many others, the great Newton would learn that markets operate by laws different from those governing the motion of planets and the fall of apples. Across London, the fever had infected every level of society. Dukes and dustmen, bishops and blacksmiths, all were caught in the speculation. The company's offices could barely contain the crowds. People pressed against the windows, shouting orders, waving handfuls of money. Politicians and members of the royal court were given special privileges, allowed to hold shares without paying for them up front, free to sell them later for full profit. This practice created an illusion of legitimacy. If the kingdom's most important men were investing, surely the company must be sound. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. The company's actual profits remained modest. Despite all the excitement about trading with Spanish colonies, the reality was that very little trade was actually taking place. Spain's restrictions were severe, the profits minimal. The gap between the company's inflated stock price and its mundane business reality was growing wider each day. August arrived with a sudden shift in the wind. The euphoria that had gripped London for months began to give way to doubt. A few astute investors, sensing that prices had risen too far, too fast, began to sell their holdings. At first, the sales were easily absorbed. There were still plenty of eager buyers, still people convinced that South Sea shares could only go higher. But the psychology was changing, shifting like the tide. Then came the moment that John Blunt had perhaps anticipated, and certainly feared. The loans he had made to investors, the money lent specifically for purchasing South Sea stock, began to come due. Suddenly, investors who had borrowed heavily found themselves in a terrible position. They needed cash to repay their loans, but their wealth was tied up in South Sea shares. They had no choice but to sell. And so the selling began, slowly at first, then faster, then in a great rushing torrent that swept away fortunes like leaves in a storm. By September, the price had plummeted to £150 per share. The same shares that had traded for £1,000 just weeks earlier were now worth less than a sixth of their peak value. Panic gripped the city. In the coffee houses where men had once boasted of their paper profits, there was now only silence and the sound of weeping. The streets around Exchange Alley, which had been filled with celebrating speculators, were now haunted by hollow-eyed investors clutching worthless certificates. Banks began to fail as loans went unpaid. Goldsmiths, the informal bankers of the era, found their vaults empty as customers demanded gold they did not possess. The entire financial system of London teetered on the edge of collapse. The panic spread across the Channel to Amsterdam, where Dutch investors had also speculated heavily in South Sea shares. At the same time, France was experiencing its own speculative collapse with the Mississippi Company scheme. It seemed as if all of Europe was learning the same bitter lesson about the madness of crowds. Among the victims was Sir Isaac Newton himself. The man who had unlocked the secrets of the cosmos lost £20,000 in the crash, equivalent to more than £260 million in today's money. Later, in the quiet of his study, surrounded by his books and instruments, Newton would reflect on his loss with characteristic insight. "I can calculate the movement of the stars," he said, "but not the madness of men." It was perhaps the most profound observation ever made about financial markets, a recognition that human psychology operates by different laws than the physical world. Even genius could not protect against the fundamental irrationality of speculative manias. As autumn deepened into winter, the full extent of the disaster became clear. Fortunes that had existed only on paper were revealed to be mirages. Families that had counted themselves wealthy found themselves destitute. There was a marked increase in suicides and widespread anger in the streets of London as the public demanded answers. By December, South Sea shares had fallen to £124, barely above their price at the beginning of that terrible year. The great bubble had burst, leaving behind only the wreckage of shattered dreams and ruined lives. The public's anger demanded satisfaction. In the halls of Parliament, voices were raised in outrage. How had this happened? Who was responsible? What could be done to prevent such disasters in the future? An investigation was launched, a formal inquiry that would dig deep into the company's affairs. The investigators worked through the winter months, sifting through ledgers and correspondence, calling witnesses and examining evidence. What they found was worse than mere incompetence. There was fraud, corruption, deliberate manipulation of both markets and men. Company directors had enriched themselves while ordinary investors lost everything. Government officials had accepted bribes and special favors. The list of the implicated read like a roster of the kingdom's elite. James Craggs the elder and younger, father and son who served as Postmaster General, were found guilty of corruption. John Aislaby, the Chancellor of the Exchequer himself, was imprisoned. Lords Sunderland and Stanhope, men who had walked the halls of power, were disgraced. Parliament acted with unusual swiftness and severity. Assets were confiscated, profits disgorged. Wealth that had been gained through fraud was redistributed to the victims. Approximately £2 million in ill-gotten gains was seized from company directors and returned to stockholders. From this chaos emerged a man who would dominate British politics for the next 2 decades. Robert Walpole, who had opposed the South Sea scheme from the beginning, was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer. His skillful handling of the crisis, his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of public outrage and financial collapse, established his reputation as the kingdom's most capable leader. Walpole understood that the crash was not merely a financial event. It was a crisis of confidence in government itself. The public's faith in institutions had been shattered. Only through decisive action and genuine reform could that trust be restored. Under his guidance, a settlement was reached in August of 1721. Stockholders would receive £140 per share. Not the £1,000 they had once imagined, but something. A recognition that they too had been victims of a grand deception. The South Sea Bubble, as historians would later call it, left scars that would last for generations. The Bubble Act remained on the books for more than a century, a reminder of the dangers of speculative excess. Joint stock companies were viewed with suspicion, their formation heavily regulated and restricted. But perhaps the most important legacy was not legal or regulatory, but psychological. The crash had taught an entire nation about the dangers of believing that wealth could be created from nothing, that markets could rise forever, that this time was somehow different. And yet, even as the rubble of the South Sea Company was still being cleared away, human nature remained unchanged. The same impulses that had driven the bubble, greed and fear, hope and desperation, continued to pulse through the hearts of men and women. The lessons learned would fade with time, to be relearned by future generations in their own moments of madness. In the decades that followed, London slowly rebuilt its reputation as a centre of finance and commerce. New safeguards were put in place, new regulations written, new institutions founded on supposedly sounder principles. The South Sea Company itself survived the crash, transformed from a speculative vehicle into a more mundane enterprise. It continued to exist for many years, managing the government debt it had originally been created to assume, a ghost of its former grandiose self. But the company's true business, the slave trade that had been at its foundation, continued with grim efficiency. While investors mourned their paper losses, the human cargo that generated the company's meager real profits continued to be transported across the Atlantic in chains. The bubble's collapse had changed many things, but not this fundamental cruelty. As we look back across 3 centuries at the South Sea Bubble, we see patterns that feel achingly familiar. The rapid rise in prices that defied all rational explanation. The euphoria that infected people from all walks of life. The manipulation by insiders who profited at the expense of ordinary investors. We see the role of leverage, of borrowed money that amplified both gains and losses. We see how regulatory responses often come too late, and sometimes have unintended consequences. We see how even the most brilliant minds can be caught up in speculative fever, and how crashes spread from one market to another with frightening speed. Most of all, we see the eternal human tendency to believe that somehow this time is different, that the old rules don't apply, that wealth can be created from nothing more than optimism and rising prices. The South Sea Bubble was perhaps the first great financial mania of the modern age, but it would not be the last. The patterns established in those coffee houses of Exchange Alley would repeat again and again. In the railway mania of the 1840s, the stock market crash of 1929, the dot-com bubble of the late 20th century, the housing crisis of 2008. Each time, the specific details would be different. The technology would advance. The regulations would evolve. The institutions would grow more sophisticated. But the fundamental human emotions would remain the same. On quiet evenings in London today, if you walk through the narrow streets where Exchange Alley once bustled with speculators, you can almost hear the echoes of that long-ago madness. The buildings have changed. The cobblestones have been replaced with modern pavement. But the ghosts of 1720 still whisper their warnings to anyone willing to listen. They tell us that markets are not machines. They are living things powered by human emotion. They remind us that prices can lose all connection to value, that crowds can become mobs, that even the wisest among us are not immune to the madness of speculation. And they remind us of something else, something that Sir Isaac Newton learned at such great cost. We can map the stars and predict the tides. We can split atoms and sequence genes. We can build computers that think faster than any human mind. But we cannot escape our own nature. The same impulses that drove those London investors to risk everything on South Sea shares, the same hopes and fears that filled the coffee houses with desperate whispers, still move through our markets today. They always will. And so the story of the South Sea Bubble is not really a story about the past. It is a story about us, about the eternal struggle between reason and emotion, between wisdom and folly, between the desire to build wealth patiently and the dream of getting rich quickly. It is a story that reminds us that history may not repeat, but it certainly rhymes. The names change, the technologies evolve, but the tune remains hauntingly familiar. As night falls over London and the last lights in the financial district fade to darkness, the Thames continues its ancient flow towards the sea. The river has watched it all, the rise and fall of fortunes, the birth and death of dreams, the endless cycle of boom and bust that seems to be woven into the very fabric of human commerce. And somewhere in that darkness, the spirit of John Blunt still schemes, the ghost of Isaac Newton still calculates, and the echoes of that terrible summer of 1720 still whisper their eternal warning, that in the madness of markets, even genius is no guarantee of wisdom. The river flows on, carrying with it the lessons of the past and the seeds of future follies. For as long as humans gather to trade, to hope, to dream of wealth beyond their station, there will be bubbles, and there will be the bursting. This is the way of things. This is the way it has always been. And this is the way it will always be. The South Sea Bubble was Britain's first great financial crash. But like the tide that rises and falls along the Thames, it was neither the first nor the last time that human dreams would collide with mathematical reality. Sleep well, and remember that in the morning the markets will open once again. But there are other stories within this story, quieter tales that deserve to be told as the embers of that great fire slowly cool. For the South Sea Bubble was not merely a matter of numbers rising and falling on ledger sheets. It was a human drama played out in drawing rooms and servants' quarters, in country estates and city tenements. Let us return to those summer days of 1720, when the fever was at its peak. and listen to the voices that history has nearly forgotten. In a modest house near Cheapside, a widow named Mary Thornton sat by her window, watching the crowds hurry past toward Exchange Alley. She had been left comfortable, not wealthy, but secure, by her late husband's trade in fine cloth. Her savings, carefully hoarded over years of frugal living, amounted to nearly £200, enough to see her through her remaining years in modest dignity. But the talk in the shops and markets was intoxicating. Her neighbours spoke of fortunes made overnight, of servants who had become richer than their masters, of a new world where birth mattered less than boldness. Mary had listened to these stories with the careful attention of someone who had learned that life rarely offers second chances. Yet slowly, gradually, the possibility began to take root in her mind. What if she could turn her £200 into 400? Or 800? What if she could secure not just survival, but comfort, perhaps even a small legacy for her sister's children? And so, on a warm July morning, Mary Thornton walked the cobblestones to Exchange Alley. She clutched her purse tightly, feeling the weight of coins that represented everything she owned in the world. The crowds were thick, the air heavy with excitement, and the smell of unwashed bodies pressed together in the heat. She found a broker, a young man with ink-stained fingers and eyes bright with the fever of speculation. He explained the installment plan, how she could purchase shares for a fraction of their value, how the remaining balance would be due in future payments that would surely be covered by the stock's continued rise. Mary nodded, signed her name with a trembling hand, and became the owner of South Sea shares worth £800. She walked home in a daze, no longer a widow living on the margins of society, but an investor, a participant in the great engine of wealth that seemed to be transforming England itself. For a few precious weeks, Mary's gamble seemed wise. The shares climbed higher, and higher still. On paper, her investment was worth £1,000, then 1,200. She began to dream of the cottage in the countryside she might buy, the comfort she might finally know. But when the crash came in August, Mary Thornton's dreams crumbled like sandcastles before the tide. The shares she had bought for £800 were suddenly worth less than 100. Worse still, she owed money, the balance on her installment purchase, money she did not have and could never hope to raise. Mary lost not just her life savings, but her modest home as well. By winter, she was living in a single room above a baker's shop, dependent on the charity of her sister for her daily bread. She never spoke of her investment again, carrying the shame of it like a physical weight until her death some years later. Mary's story was multiplied 1,000-fold across London and across England. In every parish there were widows and shopkeepers, clerks and craftsmen who had risked everything on the promise of easy wealth, and lost. But there were other stories too, tales of those who profited from the madness, who understood that bubbles, like storms, create opportunities for those clever enough to see them coming. Thomas Gresham, not related to the famous financier of Queen Elizabeth's time, but a distant cousin, was a goldsmith with a shop near Lombard Street. He had watched the early rise in South Sea shares with the eye of someone who understood both human nature and the mechanics of money. Gresham bought shares early, when they were still reasonably priced, and sold them in careful stages as the price climbed. He never held them at the peak, never succumbed to the greed that convinced so many others that prices could only rise forever. Instead, he used his profits to buy gold, quietly accumulating the precious metal as others chased paper dreams. When the crash came and desperate investors needed ready money, Gresham was there, purchasing their jewellery, their silver plate, their family heirlooms for a fraction of their true worth. By the time the bubble had fully burst, Thomas Gresham had multiplied his wealth several times over. But he was wise enough to keep his success quiet, to maintain the modest appearance of a simple goldsmith, even as his vaults filled with treasure. Years later, when the memory of the crash had faded somewhat, Gresham would quietly purchase a fine estate in Hertfordshire. He told his neighbours that he had inherited it from a distant relative, a fiction that allowed him to enjoy his wealth without attracting the resentment of those who had lost everything in the great speculation. The crash affected not just individuals, but entire industries, entire ways of life that had grown up around the bubble economy. In the months leading up to the collapse, a small army of clerks and messengers had emerged to service the speculative trade. Young men who had once swept floors or delivered parcels found themselves earning more in a week than they had previously made in a month, simply by carrying messages between investors and brokers. Coffee houses hired additional staff to accommodate the crowds of speculators. Printers worked day and night producing share certificates and trading documents. Even street vendors did a booming business, selling food and drink to the crowds that gathered daily around Exchange Alley. When the bubble burst, this entire ecosystem collapsed almost overnight. The coffee houses emptied. The printers found no demand for their services. The young clerks who had briefly tasted prosperity were turned out onto the streets. London, which had buzzed with economic activity just weeks before, suddenly seemed drained of energy, like a clockwork toy that had finally wound down. The social consequences extended far beyond mere economics. Marriages were broken by the strain of sudden poverty. Children who had been promised education found themselves apprenticed to trades instead. Plans for the future, trips to the continent, improvements to country houses, dowries for daughters, all evaporated like morning mist. In the genteel squares of Bloomsbury and Marylebone, families who had lived in comfort for generations found themselves selling their furniture to pay debts. Portraits of ancestors, books collected over lifetimes, silver services that had graced family tables for decades, all went to the auction houses. The social fabric of London was rewoven in those months after the crash. Fortunes that had seemed permanent proved ephemeral, while new wealth, built on the ruins of the old, began to establish itself. Some families never recovered. The shame of financial ruin was often more devastating than the ruin itself. Sons who had expected inheritances found themselves forced to make their own way in the world. Daughters who had anticipated comfortable marriages discovered that their dowries had vanished, and with them, their prospects for matrimony within their accustomed social circle. But perhaps nowhere was the human cost more visible than in the institutions meant to care for society's most vulnerable members. The Foundling Hospital, that great charitable enterprise that cared for London's abandoned children, had received significant donations from South Sea investors during the height of the boom. When those fortunes disappeared, so did much of the hospital's funding. Captain Thomas Coram, the hospital's founder, found himself walking London's streets once again, knocking on doors that had once opened readily, pleading for coins from purses that were now empty. The children in his care, already the victims of poverty and abandonment, became victims of the crash as well. Similar scenes played out across the city's charitable institutions. Almshouses that had provided shelter for the elderly poor found their endowments depleted. Schools that had offered education to the children of the working classes were forced to close their doors. The South Sea bubble had not just destroyed private fortunes, It had torn holes in the safety net that society had slowly constructed for its most needy members. Yet, amid all this suffering, there were signs of something that might have been hope, or perhaps merely the irrepressible human capacity for self-deception. Even before the wreckage of the South Sea Company had been fully cleared away, new schemes were being whispered about in the surviving coffee houses. Promoters spoke of opportunities in the American colonies, of profits to be made in the slave trade, of fortunes waiting in the Spice Islands of the East Indies. It seemed that no amount of financial catastrophe could entirely extinguish the human appetite for speculation. The same crowds that had cheered the rise of South Sea shares and wept at their fall were already listening, with perhaps slightly more caution than before, but listening nonetheless, to new promises of easy wealth. This eternal optimism, this refusal to accept that wealth must be built slowly and carefully rather than conjured from nothing, was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire episode. It suggested something fundamental about human nature, something that no amount of regulation or education could entirely suppress. In the halls of Parliament, the investigation into the South Sea scandal continued through the dark winter months of 1720 and into 1721. The proceedings were conducted with unusual thoroughness. Witness after witness called to account for their actions during the height of the mania. The testimony revealed a web of corruption that extended to the highest levels of government and society. Members of Parliament had received free shares. Ministers had been bribed with valuable stock. Even members of the royal household had participated in schemes that enriched insiders at the expense of ordinary investors. But perhaps most shocking was the revelation of just how little actual business the South Sea Company had conducted. For all the talk of trade with Spanish America, for all the dreams of treasure fleets and exotic goods, the company had sent fewer ships to the New World than could be counted on one hand. The gap between perception and reality had been vast, a chasm bridged only by hope and greed and the all-too-human tendency to believe in miracles. As the investigation proceeded, public anger gradually gave way to something more complex, a mixture of shame and resignation, and perhaps even a grudging admiration for the audacity of those who had engineered the scheme. For there was something almost magnificent about the scale of the deception, the sheer boldness of convincing an entire nation to invest their savings in a company that barely existed. It was fraud, certainly, but fraud elevated to the level of art. The punishment of those responsible was swift, but perhaps not as severe as the public's anger might have warranted. Prison sentences were relatively short. Confiscated assets were substantial but not ruinous, and many of those implicated eventually returned to positions of influence and wealth. This leniency reflected, perhaps, a recognition that the bubble had been as much a product of collective madness as individual villainy. The victims had been willing participants in their own destruction, eager co-conspirators in a fantasy of effortless wealth. How do you punish an entire society for its own foolishness? How do you imprison a nation for the crime of believing in miracles? The answer, it seemed, was that you did not try. Instead, you picked a few scapegoats, made examples of the most egregious offenders, and then moved on, hoping that the lesson had been learned and the madness would not return. But even as the trials proceeded and the guilty were sentenced, there were signs that the lesson was already being forgotten. Human memory, particularly when it comes to financial matters, proved remarkably short. Robert Walpole understood this better than most. As he worked to restore confidence in the government and the financial system, He knew that he was fighting against something more powerful than any individual or institution. He was fighting against human nature itself. Walpole's solution was characteristically pragmatic, rather than trying to eliminate speculation entirely. An impossible task. He sought to regulate it, to channel it into less destructive directions, to ensure that when the next bubble inevitably formed, its bursting would not bring down the entire system. New rules were established for the formation of joint stock companies. Government oversight was strengthened. The relationship between private enterprise and public financing was clarified and codified. But Walpole knew that these measures were only partially effective. Regulation could constrain behavior. It could not change the fundamental human emotions that drove speculative excess. The next bubble might take a different form, might exploit different weaknesses, but it would surely come. And so Walpole focused on building resilience rather than preventing bubbles entirely. He worked to ensure that banks had adequate reserves, that government finances were stable, that the essential functions of commerce could continue even when speculative markets collapsed. It was a wise approach, though one that required patience and long-term thinking in a world that seemed increasingly focused on immediate gratification. As 1721 gave way to 1722, life in London gradually returned to something resembling normalcy. The coffee houses still buzzed with conversation, though the talk was more often of politics than stocks. The streets of Exchange Alley still saw their share of foot traffic, though the desperate crowds of the bubble year had dispersed. New businesses emerged to fill the gaps left by those that had failed during the crash. New fortunes began to accumulate, more slowly and carefully than before, but steadily nonetheless. The great machine of commerce, having suffered a severe shock, began once again to turn. Yet something had changed. Something subtle but profound in the way people thought about money and risk and the future. There was a new wariness, a skepticism that had not existed before. The easy confidence of the bubble years had been replaced by something more cautious, more questioning. Parents who had lost their savings in South Sea shares taught their children to be suspicious of promises of easy wealth. Merchants who had survived the crash by avoiding speculation shared their hard-won wisdom with younger colleagues. The memory of the bubble became a form of collective insurance against future follies. But memories fade, and each new generation must learn its own lessons about the dangers of unchecked greed and blind optimism. In the countryside, far from the fevered atmosphere of London's financial district, the effects of the crash rippled outward like waves from a stone thrown into still water. Country gentlemen who had mortgaged their estates to buy South Sea shares found themselves facing foreclosure. Ancient family homes, properties that had been passed down through generations, were sold to settle debts incurred during a few months of speculative fever. New owners, often merchants or manufacturers who had profited from the bubble or avoided its snares, took possession of these rural estates. They brought with them different values, different ways of thinking about land and labor and the relationship between tradition and progress. The old feudal bonds that had tied lord to tenant for centuries began to weaken. Properties were managed more like businesses, with an eye toward profit rather than tradition. Agricultural methods that had remained unchanged for generations were suddenly scrutinized and often discarded in favor of more efficient practices. The South Sea bubble had not just redistributed wealth, it had accelerated social change in ways that would resonate for decades to come. Village churches found their benefactors impoverished, their tithes reduced, their ability to maintain ancient traditions compromised. Some parishes that had supported their communities for centuries found themselves struggling to maintain even basic services. Yet there were compensations. The new landowners often brought fresh ideas and capital investment. Improvements were made to roads and drainage. New crops were introduced. Innovative farming techniques were tested and refined. The bubble's collapse had destroyed one world, but it had also created space for another to emerge. In the years that followed, as the immediate trauma of the crash faded, scholars and philosophers began to examine what had happened and why. They sought to understand the psychological and social forces that had driven an entire nation to such spectacular folly. Some blamed education, or the lack thereof. If people had understood mathematics better, they argued, they would have seen through the impossibility of endless exponential growth. If they had studied history more carefully, they would have recognized the warning signs of speculative excess. Others pointed to moral failings, to greed and envy, and the desire to get rich without honest labor. The bubble, in this view, was a punishment for abandoning traditional virtues of thrift and patience and hard work. Still others saw the crash as an inevitable consequence of England's growing prosperity and sophistication. A nation with surplus capital would naturally seek new ways to invest it, and some of those investments would inevitably prove disastrous. But perhaps the wisest observers recognized that the South Sea bubble was neither an aberration nor a moral failing, but simply an expression of fundamental human nature. The same impulses that drove exploration and invention and artistic creation also drove speculation and excess. The challenge was not to eliminate these impulses, an impossible task, but to find ways to channel them constructively, to harness the energy of human ambition while minimizing its destructive potential. As the 1720s progressed, and England settled into the long period of relative stability that would characterize Walpole's administration, the South Sea Company itself underwent a curious transformation. Stripped of its speculative glamour and reduced to its core function, the management of government debt, the company became a model of conservative financial management. The same institution that had nearly brought down the British economy became one of its most reliable and boring components. The company's offices, once packed with frenzied speculators, now housed careful clerks who tracked interest payments and maintained meticulous records. The directors, chastened by their experience and closely supervised by government regulators, focused on steady returns rather than spectacular gains. It was, perhaps, the perfect metaphor for the broader changes that the crash had wrought in British financial culture. The appetite for risk had not disappeared, but it had been tempered by hard experience and hedged with careful safeguards. The slave trade that had been the company's original business continued, though it never proved as profitable as its promoters had promised. The harsh realities of oceanic commerce, the risks of disease and shipwreck and piracy, made even this brutal enterprise less lucrative than speculation had suggested. The Spanish colonies remained largely closed to British trade, their markets protected by regulations and restrictions that made meaningful commerce nearly impossible. The dreams of treasure fleets and exotic goods remained just that, dreams. And yet the company persisted, a corporate zombie that outlived its creators and served functions far removed from its original purpose. It would continue to exist, in various forms, until well into the 19th century, a testament to the peculiar immortality of financial institutions. The human stories of the South Sea bubble continued to unfold long after the collapse itself. Children who had grown up in poverty after their families lost everything in the crash carried those experiences with them throughout their lives. Some became extraordinarily cautious, saving every penny and avoiding any investment more speculative than government bonds. Others, perhaps in reaction to their parents' excessive caution, became inveterate gamblers, forever seeking the fortune that had eluded their families. The bubble created its own mythology, stories that were passed down through generations, tales of sudden wealth and spectacular ruin that became part of London's cultural DNA. Street ballads commemorated the folly. Penny broadsheets recounted the most spectacular losses. Satirical prints mocked the pretensions of those who had thought themselves financial geniuses. These cultural artifacts served a purpose beyond mere entertainment. They were society's way of processing trauma, of making sense of an experience that had challenged fundamental assumptions about money and worth and the nature of reality itself. The bubble entered the language as well. To call something a bubble was to suggest that it was insubstantial, ephemeral, likely to burst at the first touch of reality. The metaphor became so powerful that it survived for centuries, and indeed is still used today to describe speculative excess. In the decades that followed, other bubbles emerged, smaller and more contained, but recognizably related to their South Sea ancestor. The railway mania of the 1840s, the various colonial investment schemes of the 19th century, each followed patterns that would have been familiar to survivors of 1720. Each generation seemed to believe that it had learned from the mistakes of the past, that its particular bubble was different, based on sound principles rather than mere speculation. And each generation, in turn, discovered that human nature had not fundamentally changed, that the same emotions and delusions that had driven their ancestors to folly were still very much alive. The lessons of the South Sea bubble were clear enough to those willing to see them. Exponential growth cannot continue indefinitely. Prices can diverge from underlying value for only so long. Crowds can be wrong even when, especially when, they are most confident in their rightness. Yet these lessons proved remarkably difficult to internalize. Each new bubble found fresh victims, people who were convinced that this time was different, that the old rules no longer applied, that they had discovered a new path to effortless wealth. Perhaps this willingness to forget painful lessons was itself adaptive, a necessary form of optimism that allowed societies to take the risks needed for growth and progress. A world in which everyone remembered every past disaster might be a world too paralyzed by caution to achieve anything significant. The trick was finding the balance, retaining enough memory to avoid the worst mistakes while maintaining enough optimism to embrace beneficial change. As we follow the South Sea story into its final chapters, as the immediate crisis faded and became simply another episode in England's long financial history, we might reflect on what it tells us about the human condition itself. The bubble revealed both the best and worst aspects of human nature. The same ambition that drove people to risk everything in pursuit of impossible dreams also drove the merchants and manufacturers who built England's prosperity. The same capacity for self-deception that allowed investors to believe in endless growth also allowed artists and inventors to pursue visions that more practical minds would have dismissed. The social bonds that were tested by financial stress, the marriages strained by sudden poverty, the friendships ended by mutual recrimination. These too were part of the story. But so were the acts of kindness, the quiet generosity of those who had escaped ruin, the communities that came together to support their most vulnerable members. The bubble was not simply a tale of greed and folly, though it certainly contained both. It was also a story of hope and courage, and the eternal human refusal to accept that the future must be constrained by the limitations of the past. That such hope could be manipulated by unscrupulous promoters did not make it less valuable. That such courage could lead to disaster did not make it less admirable. The challenge for any society is to preserve these essential human qualities while protecting against their exploitation. In the quiet hours after midnight, when London's financial district lies empty and dark, it is possible to imagine the ghosts of 1720 still walking those narrow streets. The shade of John Blunt, perhaps, still scheming in some ethereal coffee-house. The spirit of Isaac Newton still calculating impossible equations. The phantom crowds still surging toward Exchange Alley in pursuit of dreams that turned to dust. These ghosts serve as witnesses, reminders of a time when an entire nation convinced itself that it could suspend the laws of economics through the sheer power of collective belief. They whisper warnings to each new generation of investors and entrepreneurs, cautionary tales about the dangers of confusing innovation with speculation, progress with mere price increases. Yet they also whisper something else, something about the magnificent audacity of human ambition, the refusal to accept limitations, the eternal desire to transform the world through the alchemy of commerce and imagination. The South Sea Bubble was many things: disaster and opportunity, tragedy and comedy, cautionary tale and inspiration. But perhaps most of all, it was profoundly human, a reflection of who we are when stripped of our pretenses and faced with the possibility of either great gain or great loss. In that sense, it remains as relevant today as it was 3 centuries ago. The specific mechanisms of speculation have evolved. The technologies have advanced. The regulatory frameworks have grown more sophisticated. But the fundamental human emotions that drive bubbles and crashes remain unchanged. We still dream of easy wealth, still convince ourselves that we are smarter than those who came before, still believe that we have discovered secret that previous generations missed. We still gather in crowds, still reinforce each other's delusions, still mistake temporary price movements for permanent changes in the nature of reality. And perhaps that is as it should be. A world without bubbles might be a world without the optimism and risk-taking that drive genuine progress. The trick is not to eliminate speculation entirely, but to ensure that when bubbles inevitably burst, they do not bring down the entire system with them. The builders of modern financial systems have tried to learn from episodes like the South Sea Bubble, to create institutions and regulations that can channel speculative energy constructively while containing its destructive potential. They have had mixed success, achieving stability for decades at a time before being surprised by new forms of excess that previous regulations had not anticipated. But the effort continues, this eternal struggle to balance innovation with stability, speculation with prudence, human ambition with human folly. The South Sea Bubble reminds us that this balance is never permanently achieved, that each generation must find its own way, must learn its own lessons, must discover for itself the boundaries between the possible and the impossible. As our story draws toward its close, as the last echoes of that long-ago crash fade into the darkness of history, we might pause to consider what the bubble's victims and survivors would think of our modern world. They would surely be amazed by the sophistication of our markets, the speed of our communications, the complexity of our financial instruments. They might be impressed by the safeguards we have constructed, the insurance schemes and regulatory bodies and central banks that stand ready to intervene when speculation threatens to become catastrophic. but they might also recognize patterns that would seem familiar. The same human emotions dressed in new clothes. The same fundamental tensions between fear and greed that have driven markets for as long as humans have gathered to trade. They might smile, with the bitter wisdom of experience, at our confidence that we have solved the problems that destroyed them. They might warn us that each generation believes itself wiser than the last, right up until the moment when its own certainties are revealed to be illusions. And they might remind us that the price of financial stability, like the price of freedom, is eternal vigilance, not vigilance against external enemies, but against the enemy within, the part of human nature that will always be tempted by the promise of something for nothing. The Thames still flows past the City of London, carrying with it the memories of centuries of commerce and speculation. Boom and bust, triumph and disaster, the river has outlasted countless bubbles, witnessed the rise and fall of countless fortunes, carried away the debris of countless dreams. In its steady flow, we might find a kind of comfort, a reminder that markets may rise and fall, but life continues. That individual disasters, however catastrophic they may seem to those who experience them, are part of a larger pattern, episodes in a longer story of human struggle and achievement. The South Sea Bubble was not the first speculative mania in history, nor was it the last, but it holds a special place in the memory of markets, a cautionary tale so perfect in its arc of rise and fall that it seems almost mythological. Like all great myths, it contains truths that transcend its specific historical moment, insights about human nature that remain valid regardless of changes in technology or regulation or social structure. It reminds us that we are not as rational as we like to believe, not as immune to crowd psychology as we might hope, not as different from our ancestors as we sometimes assume. But it also reminds us that this very irrationality, this susceptibility to dreams and delusions, is part of what makes us human. To eliminate it entirely would be to eliminate something essential, something that connects us to the great currents of ambition and hope that have driven human progress for millennia. The challenge is not to transcend our nature, but to understand it, to recognize its patterns, to prepare for its cycles, and to build institutions resilient enough to survive our periodic fits of collective madness. And so we leave our story where we began, in the quiet hours when markets sleep and dreams take hold, when the ghosts of past bubbles walk the empty streets and whisper their eternal warnings to anyone willing to listen. The South Sea Bubble is history now, a tale told by firelight to new generations of investors and entrepreneurs. But the forces that created it, the human emotions that drove it, the patterns it revealed, these remain as relevant today as they were in 1720. Tomorrow, markets will open again. New dreams will be born. New schemes will be proposed. New bubbles will begin to form. And somewhere in the crowd of eager investors and ambitious entrepreneurs, the spirit of the South Sea Bubble will live on, reminding us that in the theatre of human commerce, the same dramas play out again and again, with different actors perhaps, and different costumes, but with the same eternal themes of hope and fear, greed and caution, wisdom and folly. This is the way of markets. This is the way of money. This is the way of human nature itself. And this, as the river flows on toward the sea, as the ghosts settle back into their eternal rest, as the memories fade into legend and the legends become myth. This is the way it will always be. Sleep well, and remember that every bubble teaches the same lesson to those wise enough to listen. But wisdom, like wealth, is something that each generation must earn for itself. The morning after a bubble bursts is always the same, eerily quiet, as if the city itself is holding its breath. In the weeks following the South Sea collapse, London experienced such mornings again and again, days when the usual bustle of commerce seemed muted, when even the street vendors called their wares more softly. There was something in the air, a collective embarrassment, a shared acknowledgement that an entire society had participated in its own deception. In the coffee houses that had once echoed with excited chatter about rising share prices, conversations now turned to other matters: the weather, politics, anything but the recent catastrophe that had touched so many lives. Yet beneath this surface calm, the real work of recovery was beginning. Not the dramatic work of parliamentary investigations and government interventions, but the quieter, more personal work of rebuilding shattered lives and broken dreams. In a small room above a tailor's shop in Cheapside, Elizabeth Hartwell sat at her writing desk, carefully composing letters to creditors. She had been, until recently, the wife of a prosperous merchant, living in comfort in a handsome house near Lincoln's Inn Fields. Her husband Thomas had been among those who borrowed heavily to buy South Sea shares at their peak, convinced that his business acumen would allow him to time the market perfectly. Thomas had not survived the shame of bankruptcy. He had taken his own life in September, when the full extent of their losses became clear, leaving Elizabeth to face their creditors alone. She was now reduced to a single room, surviving on the charity of her sister and the small income she could earn by taking in sewing. But Elizabeth Hartwell was made of stern stuff. Each morning she rose before dawn and worked by candlelight until her eyes grew too tired to continue. Each penny she earned went toward paying down the debts her husband had left behind, debts that were legally his, but morally hers. Her letters to creditors were models of dignity and determination. She acknowledged what was owed, proposed realistic payment schedules, and never once asked for charity or made excuses. She would pay what could be paid, slowly and with great sacrifice, but she would pay it. "I am sensible of the debt my late husband contracted," she wrote to one creditor, "and though I am not bound by law to discharge it, I am bound by honour. You shall receive what is owed, though it take me the remainder of my days." Elizabeth lived for another 23 years, and she kept her word. The last debt was paid in 1743 from money she had saved coin by coin over more than 2 decades of careful economy. She never remarried, never lived anywhere but in modest lodgings, but she slept peacefully, knowing that her husband's honour had been preserved. Stories like Elizabeth's were repeated throughout London in the years following the crash. They were not the dramatic tales that filled the broadsheets and ballads, but they were perhaps more important, quiet examples of how ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances with grace and determination. In the parish of St. Giles, Cripplegate, the rector Dr. William Pearson noticed an unusual phenomenon in the months after the bubble burst. His Sunday congregations, which had dwindled during the height of the speculation, began to grow again. People who had been too busy chasing profits to attend services returned to their pews, perhaps seeking comfort, perhaps seeking forgiveness, perhaps simply needing the stability of ritual in a world that had proven so unreliable. Dr. Pearson was a wise man who understood that sermons about the evils of greed would fall on deaf ears. His parishioners had learned those lessons themselves, in the hardest possible way. Instead, he spoke of forgiveness, of the possibility of beginning again, of the difference between earthly treasures that could be lost in a moment and spiritual treasures that could never be taken away. "We have seen," he said in one sermon that winter, How quickly the things of this world can vanish. Gold turns to dross. Shares become worthless paper. Fortunes built over lifetimes disappear in a day. But the love of family, the bonds of friendship, the peace that comes from right living, these endure. The collection plate was lighter in those days, but Dr. Pearson noticed that people gave more thoughtfully, considering each coin before dropping it in. Money had regained its weight, its meaning, its connection to actual labor and sacrifice. Not all the stories of those years were tales of noble suffering and moral redemption. The crash created opportunities for those clever enough to see them, and ruthless enough to exploit them. Jonathan Blackwood had been a minor clerk in a trading house before the bubble. He had watched the speculation with the detached interest of someone who possessed neither the capital to participate nor the connections to profit from insider information. But he was observant, and he understood that every great disruption creates new possibilities for those prepared to seize them. As bankruptcies multiplied and assets were sold at forced auctions, Blackwood began to accumulate property. Not grand estates or fashionable houses, but smaller properties, workshops and warehouses, and modest homes that could be purchased for a fraction of their former value. Blackwood had saved carefully during his years as a clerk, living simply and avoiding the temptations that had destroyed so many others. His savings were modest by the standards of the bubble era, but in the deflationary aftermath of the crash, they went much further than he had ever imagined possible. By 1725, Jonathan Blackwood owned 17 properties scattered across London. He rented them to families displaced by the crash, to merchants trying to rebuild their businesses, to artisans who needed workshops but could no longer afford to buy. His rents were fair, his treatment of tenants decent, but his profits were substantial. Blackwood never spoke of his good fortune, never boasted of his acquisitions, never drew attention to his growing wealth. He had learned from observing the bubble that discretion was often more valuable than gold. He continued to live simply, to dress modestly, to present the appearance of a man of ordinary means. But in his private ledgers, carefully maintained in his own neat hand, the numbers told a different story. The South Sea bubble had been a catastrophe for many, but for Jonathan Blackwood, it had been the foundation of a fortune that would eventually rival those lost in the crash. The crash affected different parts of society in different ways, and these differences revealed much about the social structure of early 18th century England. The great landed families, those whose wealth was rooted in broad acres rather than paper securities, generally weathered the storm better than others. Yes, some had mortgaged their estates to buy South Sea shares, and these suffered accordingly. But most had been too conservative, or perhaps too suspicious of newfangled financial instruments, to risk their ancestral patrimony on speculation. The Duke of Marlborough, for instance, had been approached repeatedly by South Sea promoters eager to attract his investment. But the old soldier, veteran of countless battles, had learned to be suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true. He kept his wealth in land and government bonds, boring investments that preserved his fortune while others lost theirs. "I have seen enough of bubbles on the battlefield," he reportedly told one persistent promoter, "to know that they always burst when you least expect it." The merchant classes, the backbone of England's commercial economy, were hit harder. These were people who understood trade and manufacturing, who were comfortable with risk and familiar with credit, but who lacked the deep reserves that might have cushioned their fall. Many merchant families saw generations of careful accumulation wiped out in a matter of weeks. but their skills and connections often allowed them to rebuild more quickly than others. They understood markets, they knew how to spot opportunities, and they had the contacts necessary to secure credit when circumstances improved. The working classes, those who possessed neither capital to lose nor property to mortgage, were affected more indirectly, but no less severely. The crash eliminated jobs, reduced wages, and created a general economic contraction that touched even those who had never owned a share of stock. Servants were dismissed from great houses that could no longer afford them. Artisans found demand for their products reduced as customers tightened their belts. Labourers discovered that work was scarce and wages lower than before the bubble began. Yet this group also proved most resilient in some ways. They were accustomed to economic uncertainty, familiar with hardship, skilled at making do with less. They had not fallen as far because they had not climbed as high. The psychological effects of the crash proved as important as the economic ones, perhaps more important in the long run. A generation of English investors had experienced something that would shape their attitudes toward risk and reward for the rest of their lives. They had learned that prices could fall as quickly as they rose, that paper profits could vanish overnight, that even the most respectable companies could prove to be built on nothing more substantial than hope and hot air. This experience created what we might now call a risk premium, an extra margin of safety that investors demanded before committing their capital. Interest rates remained higher than they might otherwise have been. Credit was extended more cautiously. New ventures were scrutinized more carefully. Some economists argue that this increased caution actually hampered England's economic development in the years following the crash. Capital that might have flowed into productive enterprises instead remained idle in government bonds and bank deposits. Innovation was starved of funding. Entrepreneurs struggled to find backing. Promising ventures died for want of investment. But others contend that this caution was ultimately beneficial, that it forced entrepreneurs to develop more solid business plans, more realistic projections, more sustainable growth strategies. The easy money of the bubble years had encouraged sloppy thinking and wishful projections. The tighter credit of the post-bubble era demanded greater rigor and discipline. The truth, as often happens, probably lay somewhere between these extremes. The crash certainly made capital more expensive and harder to obtain, but it also ensured that the capital that was invested was deployed more thoughtfully and effectively. Robert Walpole's management of the crisis recovery proved masterful, a textbook example of how skilled political leadership can guide a nation through financial catastrophe. Walpole understood that the immediate crisis was not merely financial, but psychological. Public confidence in institutions had been shattered. Faith in the government's competence had been questioned. The very foundations of commercial society had been shaken. His first priority was restoring trust. This meant holding the guilty accountable, ensuring that justice was seen to be done, demonstrating that the system could police itself and punish wrongdoing. The parliamentary investigation served this purpose, even if its ultimate penalties were perhaps less severe than popular anger might have demanded. But Walpole also understood that punishment alone was insufficient. The system that had allowed the bubble to develop needed reform. New safeguards needed to be implemented. New mechanisms for oversight and regulation needed to be created. The Bubble Act was one such reform, though its immediate effects were limited and its long-term consequences debatable. More important were the informal changes, the new culture of caution that developed among financiers and government officials. the heightened awareness of the dangers of speculative excess. Walpole's own political style embodied this new caution. He avoided dramatic gestures, shunned grand schemes, focused on steady, incremental progress rather than revolutionary change. His motto might have been, "No adventures," a conscious rejection of the speculative spirit that had brought such trouble. This approach served England well for more than 2 decades. Under Walpole's leadership, the nation experienced unprecedented stability and gradual prosperity. The wounds left by the South Sea crash slowly healed. Confidence gradually returned, and the foundations were laid for the Industrial Revolution that would transform Britain in the second half of the 18th century. Yet, even as England recovered from its first great financial crash, the seeds of future bubbles were already being planted. Human nature had not changed. The fundamental drivers of speculation remained as powerful as ever, and new opportunities for excess would inevitably arise. In the American colonies, land speculation was beginning to attract investors who had grown tired of the conservative opportunities available in London. Vast tracts of wilderness were being bought and sold based on optimistic projections of future settlement and development. The pattern was familiar, prices rising beyond any reasonable relationship to present value, investors convinced that growth could continue indefinitely. In the Caribbean, sugar plantations were attracting capital from investors seeking higher returns than government bonds could provide. The brutal economics of slave labor produced impressive profits in good years, but the risks were substantial. Disease, weather, slave revolts, fluctuating commodity prices, all could wipe out years of accumulated gains in a matter of months. Even in London itself, new forms of speculation were developing. Marine insurance, still a relatively new industry, attracted investors who hoped to profit from the expanding global trade. Some insurance companies were sound, carefully calculating risks and setting appropriate premiums. Others were little more than gambling operations, accepting risks they could never pay if called upon to do so. Each of these developments followed patterns that would have been familiar to survivors of the South Sea crash. Promoters made extravagant promises. Investors suspended their critical judgment. Prices rose beyond reasonable levels. And eventually, inevitably, reality reasserted itself with painful force. The difference was one of scale and containment. The regulatory changes implemented after 1720, the increased awareness of speculative dangers, the more cautious approach of major financial institutions, all served to limit the damage when these smaller bubbles burst. Individual investors might be ruined, particular industries might suffer, but the crashes remained localized rather than threatening the entire financial system. As the 1720s gave way to the 1730s, a new generation began to enter the world of finance and commerce. These were young people who had grown up hearing stories of the South Sea bubble, who had witnessed its effects on their families and communities, but who had not experienced the crash themselves. This generation's relationship with financial risk was complex and sometimes contradictory. On one hand, they had been raised to be cautious, taught to be suspicious of get-rich-quick schemes, warned about the dangers of speculation. The lessons of 1720 were part of their education, woven into the fabric of their understanding of how markets worked. But they were also young, ambitious, eager to make their own fortunes rather than simply preserving what others had built. They looked at the conservative investment strategies of their elders and sometimes saw excessive timidity, missed opportunities, capital deployed too cautiously to generate significant returns. Some of these young investors began to push boundaries. to test the limits of acceptable risk, to explore new forms of speculation that their elders had avoided. They told themselves that they were wiser than the South Sea investors, that they had learned from history and would not repeat its mistakes. In many cases, they were right. The lessons of the bubble had indeed created a more sophisticated understanding of financial risk. New analytical techniques were developed. Better methods for evaluating investments were created. More robust systems for managing portfolios were implemented. But in other cases, the confidence of youth proved misplaced. The same psychological forces that had driven the South Sea speculation, greed and fear, hope and envy, remained as powerful as ever. New forms of excess emerged, different in their details, but familiar in their underlying dynamics. The South Sea Company itself, meanwhile, continued its strange corporate existence, stripped of its speculative glamour and reduced to its core function as a manager of government debt. The company became a monument to the power of conservative finance. The same institution that had once embodied the wildest dreams of speculative excess now represented the virtues of steady, predictable returns. Its directors, chastened by their experience and closely supervised by government regulators, focused obsessively on risk management and careful record-keeping. The company's annual reports became models of financial transparency, detailed documents that provided clear information about assets, liabilities, and operations. The contrast with the vague promises and optimistic projections of the bubble years could not have been starker. Investors who purchased South Sea shares in the post-bubble era were not seeking excitement. They wanted safety and steady income. The company's stock became a favorite of widows and orphans, of conservative trustees managing family fortunes, of institutions seeking reliable returns with minimal risk. It was, in its way, the perfect rehabilitation. The company that had nearly destroyed British finance became one of its most stable pillars, proof that even the most spectacular failures could be transformed into boring successes with proper management and oversight. But the company's slave trade operations continued, a grim reminder of the human cost that underlay even the most respectable financial enterprises. Ships continued to sail from Africa to the Americas, carrying human cargo that generated the profits needed to pay dividends to shareholders. This aspect of the company's business was rarely discussed in polite society, relegated to brief mentions in annual reports and obscure administrative documents. The moral questions raised by profiting from human misery were generally avoided, treated as matters of practical commerce rather than ethical concern. It would take many more decades, and considerable social and political pressure, before the moral contradictions of enterprises like the South Sea Company would be fully confronted and addressed. The intellectual legacy of the South Sea bubble proved as important as its financial and political consequences. The crash had demonstrated that markets could behave in ways that defied rational analysis, that crowd psychology could override individual judgment, that financial systems were more fragile and unpredictable than most people had imagined. Scholars and philosophers began to grapple with these insights, to develop new theories about how markets worked and why they sometimes failed so spectacularly. The bubble became a case study, examined and re-examined by generations of thinkers seeking to understand the relationship between human psychology and economic behavior. Some focused on the role of information, arguing that the bubble had developed because investors lacked accurate data about the South Sea Company's actual prospects. Better disclosure, more rigorous accounting standards, improved communication between companies and investors, all might help prevent future disasters. Others emphasized the importance of regulation, the need for government oversight to prevent fraud and manipulation. The Bubble Act was an early example of such thinking, though its effectiveness remained questionable and its long-term consequences unclear. Still others looked deeper into the psychological and social forces that drove speculative behavior. They began to recognize that bubbles were not simply the result of insufficient information or inadequate regulation, but expressions of fundamental aspects of human nature that no amount of reform could entirely eliminate. This last group of thinkers proved most prescient, though their insights would take centuries to be fully developed and accepted. They understood that markets were not purely rational mechanisms, but complex social phenomena shaped by emotion, psychology, and group dynamics. The South Sea bubble had provided a perfect natural experiment in crowd psychology, demonstrating how intelligent individuals could be swept along by collective enthusiasm, how rational analysis could be overwhelmed by social pressure and emotional contagion. These insights would eventually contribute to new fields of study: behavioral economics, financial psychology, the science of decision-making under uncertainty. But in the 18th century, they remained largely intuitive observations rather than systematic theories. As the years passed, and the immediate memory of the crash began to fade, the South Sea bubble took on an almost mythological quality in British culture. It became a cautionary tale told to new generations of investors, a standard example of how not to behave in financial markets, a touchstone for discussions about greed, folly, and the dangers of collective delusion. The story was simplified and stylized in the telling, reduced to easily digestible moral lessons about the virtues of thrift and the dangers of speculation. Complex economic and social phenomena were transformed into simple narratives of good and evil, wise and foolish, prudent and reckless. This mythologization served important social functions, providing shared reference points for understanding financial risk, creating cultural antibodies against speculative excess, establishing norms and expectations about acceptable investment behavior. But it also obscured some of the bubble's more subtle lessons: the ways in which speculation could drive genuine innovation, the difficulty of distinguishing between productive investment and destructive gambling, the complex relationship between risk and reward that lay at the heart of all economic progress. The myth of the South Sea bubble emphasized its catastrophic ending while downplaying the genuine achievements that had accompanied its rise. The capital mobilized during the bubble years had funded some worthwhile enterprises. The financial innovations developed to support speculation had found productive applications. The lessons learned from the crash had contributed to more sophisticated risk management techniques. Like all myths, the South Sea story contained both truth and distortion, both wisdom and oversimplification. Its value lay not in its historical accuracy, but in its power to communicate important truths about human nature and financial markets. The international dimensions of the South Sea crisis also provided important lessons about the interconnected nature of financial systems. The panic had spread rapidly from London to Amsterdam, had coincided with similar crashes in France and other European markets, had demonstrated that no nation, however wealthy or well-regulated, was immune to speculative contagion. This interconnectedness was still relatively limited in the early 18th century, confined mainly to a small number of major commercial centers and wealthy investors. But the principle was clear. Financial markets were becoming global phenomena, and crises in one location could quickly spread to others. The implications of this interconnectedness would become more apparent in later centuries as communication improved and capital flows increased. But the South Sea bubble had provided an early warning, a demonstration that financial stability was becoming a shared responsibility that required international cooperation and coordination. The crash had also revealed the importance of central banking and financial regulation, though these institutions were still in their infancy in 1720. The Bank of England had played a limited role in managing the crisis, partly because its powers were still circumscribed, and partly because the nature of central banking was not yet well understood. Later, central bankers would study the South Sea episode carefully, learning from both the mistakes made and the opportunities missed. The crisis became a foundational case study in how monetary policy and financial regulation could be used to prevent bubbles from forming and to limit the damage when they inevitably burst. But these lessons would take time to be absorbed and implemented. The development of modern central banking was a gradual process that would unfold over many decades, shaped by successive crises and the hard-won wisdom they provided. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the South Sea bubble was its demonstration that financial markets were fundamentally human institutions, subject to all the strengths and weaknesses that implied. No amount of mathematical sophistication or regulatory oversight could entirely eliminate the role of emotion and psychology in driving market behavior. This insight would prove both humbling and liberating for future generations of financiers and regulators. Humbling because it suggested that perfect market stability was likely impossible, that bubbles and crashes were probably inevitable features of any dynamic financial system. Liberating because it freed them from the burden of trying to achieve the impossible and allowed them to focus on more realistic goals. The aim was not to eliminate risk, but to manage it. Not to prevent all bubbles, but to contain their damage. Not to create perfect rationality, but to work with human nature as it actually existed, rather than as idealized theories suggested it should be. This more modest but realistic approach to financial regulation and policy would eventually prove more effective than earlier attempts to create perfectly rational and stable markets. It acknowledged the messiness of human behavior while still striving to channel that behavior in constructive directions. The South Sea bubble had taught a painful but valuable lesson, that financial markets were not mechanical systems that could be perfectly controlled, but organic phenomena that needed to be carefully tended and guided. Like gardens, they required constant attention and occasional pruning, but they could never be made entirely predictable or safe. This horticultural metaphor, markets as gardens rather than machines, would have seemed strange to many 18th century observers. But it captured something important about the nature of finance that the South Sea crash had revealed: the delicate balance between growth and stability, between innovation and prudence, between individual ambition and collective welfare. As we reach the end of our long journey through the South Sea bubble, as the last echoes of that distant crash fade into the silence of history, we might reflect on what this 300-year-old story can teach us about our own times. The specific details of the bubble, the slave trade that funded it, the primitive communications that shaped it, the limited regulatory framework that failed to contain it, all belong to a vanished world. But the human emotions that drove the speculation, the psychological forces that created the crash, the social dynamics that determined its impact, these remain remarkably unchanged. We still see bubbles forming in our modern markets, still witness the same patterns of euphoria and despair, still struggle with the same challenges of balancing innovation with stability. The South Sea story reminds us that we are not the first generation to face these dilemmas, and we will not be the last. Each age must learn its own lessons about financial risk, must find its own balance between caution and ambition. must develop its own institutions for managing the eternal tension between human greed and human wisdom. The South Sea Bubble was one chapter in this ongoing story, neither the first nor the last, but perhaps one of the most instructive. It shows us both the heights of human folly and the depths of human resilience, both the dangers of unchecked speculation and the possibilities of recovery and renewal. Most importantly, it reminds us that financial markets are not abstract systems, but human institutions, shaped by the hopes and fears, the dreams and nightmares, the wisdom and folly of the people who participate in them. Understanding this humanity is the key to understanding finance itself, not as a technical discipline divorced from human emotion, but as one of the most fundamental expressions of human nature, our eternal struggle to transform present resources into future security, to build something lasting from the raw materials of ambition and hope. The Thames still flows past London's financial district, carrying with it the memories of countless bubbles and crashes, countless fortunes made and lost, countless dreams born and shattered. The river endures, as does the human spirit that drives us to keep trying, to keep building, to keep believing that this time, perhaps, we might finally get it right. But getting it right, as the South Sea Bubble taught us, may not mean eliminating risk and uncertainty. It may mean learning to live with them, to work with them, to channel them in directions that serve human flourishing rather than human destruction. This is the eternal challenge, the endless project that each generation inherits from those who came before. The South Sea Bubble was Britain's contribution to this great work, its gift to the ongoing human experiment in finance and commerce. And perhaps, in the quiet hours when markets sleep and dreams take hold, that is gift enough. The story ends where all such stories must, not with final answers but with eternal questions, not with perfect solutions but with hard-won wisdom, not with the elimination of human folly but with a deeper understanding of its patterns and possibilities. Sleep well and dream wisely. For tomorrow, as always, the markets will open again.